Hey performers, Happy New Year. I hope you had a great New Year's Eve show. I hope it went off without a hitch and you had a lot of fun. We're now officially in 2023. Welcome to the new year. Welcome to January where it's cold and it's kind of sweater weather. So I thought let's talk about that. Today I want to ask you a particular question about how you talk to your audience on stage. Are you knitting a sweater? Let's discuss. Welcome back to Danny Robertson Music, where we try to help you become the best possible performer that you can be on whatever stage you choose. I'm Danny Robertson. Thanks for joining us again this week. If you haven't seen us before, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, join our social media, and sign up for our email list at DannyRobertsonMusic.com, where you can find a lot more about what we're trying to do to help you get to that next performance level. Today, let's talk about storytelling. Let's talk about knitting a sweater on stage. So what do I mean by knitting a sweater? Well, let me tell you a quick story to explain. There's a member of my family who worked for a large company, global company, that he had to speak in front of large audiences quite regularly for his job for many, many years. And we talked about a few golden rules about speaking on stage. One of those golden rules is to never knit a sweater on stage. So what does that actually mean? Well, think of it like this. There's a couple of ways to tell a story on stage. You have the version that everyone assumes they're doing, whether they are or they're not, is they're starting with point A, they're telling the story through its incremental steps till the end point of the story, which is point Z. But what most people actually do when they are telling a story, whether it be on stage or not, is they knit a sweater. They start with point A just like you assume that they would, but then you end up going from point A to point C to point J to point B. You're going on tangents and telling sub-stories that don't actually relate back to the main point of the story. Let's take a look at a quick nursery rhyme to see an example of this. I want to talk about Jack and Jill. Now, Jack and Jill, we all know what they did. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Okay? We all know that line. Now let's tell that story like we're knitting a sweater. Jack and Jill went up the hill, got that far, but they stopped along the way to look at a daffodil because Jack thought it was pretty, and then Jill noticed an entire group of rabbits that were hiding behind a tree. They checked them out, they tried to catch one, and it was really exciting for them both. Then they made their way up the hill, and they ran into a friend and talked with that friend about the weather and what he was going to be doing this weekend. Eventually, they got to the top of the hill and they sat down, chilled out, and had some cheese and crackers for a little while. And then Jack got up to stretch and somehow slipped and ended up falling down that hill. I don't know. I'm making it up as I go. But you understand my point here. The entire story is that Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. I didn't even bring up the fetching a pail of water because I was too busy telling too many other pieces of the story. Knitting a sweater means telling your story in an elongated fashion where you're going off on tangents and not really sticking to the main points of the story. And therefore, you get lost in the details of the story without actually realizing it. So what can we do to avoid knitting a sweater on stage? Well, there's a few key things that you can do to prepare yourself. The first one's obvious. Plan ahead. On your set list, plan for things to say during the middle of your show. If you're at a wedding, you want to make sure that you bring up the bride and groom. If you're at a bar, you might want to talk about the drink specials. If you're playing a big concert at a festival or something like that, maybe thank the sponsors for allowing you to come in and be part of the entertainment. Having a handful of things planned out for your show before you ever get started will help to keep you focused on the main key points of your performance. Secondarily, there is another way to plan ahead when you're performing on stage. You've written everything down so that you know the key points you want to say that's on your set list, and you've got those key points planned out before you ever play your show. But when you actually go to play your performance and you go to speak on stage, stop for a second, think about what you want to say before you say it. Because what happens is, very frequently, is you have something planned out and then you go to talk about it and then you go off on a tangent from there. Think ahead before you actually start talking. The second thing I want you to do to avoid knitting a sweater on stage is to keep it short. No matter what you want to say on stage, if you have the ability to elongate it, don't. That is where everybody gets themselves into trouble. Because once you start talking, it's really hard to stay on that main focus point unless you keep it short. The third thing I want you to remember to avoid knitting a sweater on stage is to talk with a purpose every single time you speak. Don't go and tell a story that doesn't need to be said on stage. Don't just talk for the sake of killing dead space, because you get yourself into trouble that way. The more you can talk with a purpose, the more consistency you should see from your live show in terms of how your audience reacts to you and does what you want them to do. When you tell a story on stage, it really, really, really needs to have a point. Because if you don't have a point, there's no reason for your audience to care. And if there's no reason for them to care, there's no reason for them to listen to you. Which brings me to my final point. The last thing I'd suggest if you want to avoid knitting a sweater on stage, to make it about your audience. If you make every story, every time you talk to them, about them, they're going to pay attention. The best performers do the same thing. They don't talk all high and mighty about their stories. They talk about the audience. That's it for this week. Quick reminder, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the YouTube channel and join my email list at DannyRobertsonMusic.com. Thanks again for watching this week. I'll see you next week. In the meantime, I wish you best of luck on your next great performance. You take care.